We're going to go ahead and get started. The panelists can come up to the front if that's all right. Thank you. Yeah. Well, good afternoon, and welcome to the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission's hearing on Egypt, human rights 7 years after the revolution. I'd like to thank our distinguished experts for taking the time out of their busy schedules and important work to come and testify on this topic today. In the winter of 2011, the world watched with amazement and some nervousness as hundreds of thousands of Egyptians took to the streets to demand the universal rights they felt they had been denied. The massive and largely nonviolent display of protest led to the resignation of President Mubarak and inspired hope amongst Egyptians and the international community for the kind of government that might arise in its aftermath. Almost 7 years after the revolution, has the human rights situation improved in Egypt? As Vice President Pence prepares to visit Egypt this month, we wish to better understand where Egypt stands on human rights issues and the related international commitments it has made. It's because Egypt is such a strong and long-standing ally of the United States that we believe these issues are so important. Today's hearing will focus on 3 key areas of human rights in Egypt, including rule of law as it affects civil society, Coptic Christians and religious freedom, and prisoners of conscience and their prison conditions. Earlier this year, President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi ratified a new Ngo law, Law 70 of 2017, that restricts civil society groups in Egypt from implementing developmental and charity programs outside of government control. The law requires NGOs to receive prior approval from internal security before accepting foreign funds. It also restricts the scope of permitted NGO activities and increases penalties for violations. Other laws have passed placing state control over media outlets, restricting the right to peaceful assembly and protest, and expanding the president's power to appoint members of top judicial bodies. Egypt's Coptic Christians and other religious minorities continue to endure persecution, with several church closures in October alone. Violent terrorist attacks against church congregations continue to target and kill worshipers in the space where they should feel safest. In addition to the attacks against the Coptic communities, I was very saddened to hear about the killing of over 300 Sufi Muslims in Egypt 2 weeks ago. This is a tragedy that no person or family should have to endure. Freedom of belief is a cornerstone human right that every individual and community is entitled to. Lastly, the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission has taken a special interest in the cases of prisoners of conscience around the world so that the world does not forget about those who are having their most basic rights taken away. Thousands of prisoners languish in Egyptian prisons without charges, access to legal counsel, due process, or even proper food and medical care. Ola al-Qaradawi, and her husband, Hussam Khalaf, are U.S. legal permanent residents with 8 American citizen family members. Ola and Hussam have been held for over 150 days in incommunicado solitary confinement in violation of Egyptian and international law. They have been denied all access to family or legal counsel and are held in windowless cells 24 hours a day with only a 5-minute bathroom break daily. They have been denied regular access to the canteen, resulting in serious weight loss for both of them from the inedible food. While the state-run media claims that they have been charged with crimes, their lawyer has been given no information in writing of any kind, and the Egyptian government has declined repeated requests to address these grave violations. Another similar example is Mohamed Hussein, an Egyptian journalist who was arrested in December 2016. He has been in prison now for a year, spending his first 100 days in solitary confinement. To date, he has still not seen a judge or been able to determine the charges against him. Pretrial detentions, like Mohamed's, are renewed every 45 days. Meanwhile, the prisoner suffers under inhumane conditions without access to due process. We recognize Egypt is facing very difficult security threats from dangerous terrorist organizations and armed groups, but we encourage the government to combat these threats within the framework of human rights and their commitments to international law. I look forward to hearing an update on these different aspects of the human rights situation in Egypt and how the United States government can better partner with the Egyptian government on these issues. So again, thank you all for being here. This is a really important hearing, and it shows with the great interest that we have in this as well. With that, I would like to turn to our panelists for your presentation. First, grateful to have I think Amy Hawthorne will go first, Deputy Director for Research Project on Middle East Democracy. Next is George Gurgis. Gurgis, thank you, sorry about that. George Gurgis, President of the Coptic Solidarity. Next, Joe Stork, former Deputy Director of the Middle East and North Africa Division, Human Rights Watch. And then Michelle Dunn, Senior Fellow and Director of the Middle East Program, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Thank you all so much for being here. It's a busy day, I apologize. So colleagues will be coming in and out. My co-chairman, Jim McGovern, should be coming in shortly, but I know he had several other markups today, so and there'll be other colleagues that'll come in as well. But we'll be certain to share your testimony with our colleagues as well. But with that, hand it to Amy if you'd start us.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and your colleagues for convening this important hearing and for inviting me to testify. The United States and the people of Egypt want a stable, secure, and peaceful Egypt, but the mass human rights violations taking place threaten that hope. I have been asked to speak about the draconian legal framework that the regime of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi is building to, quote, legalize these rights violations, and on the role of Egypt's parliament in that process. Since the ouster of President Mohamed Morsi in July 2013, Egypt has descended into a military autocracy, one even more brutal than the dictatorship of Hosni Mubarak. Tens of thousands of citizens have been harassed, forcibly disappeared, imprisoned, tortured, and even killed for the, quote, crime of opposing the government. Victims of this vast crackdown include some 40,000 political prisoners, Islamists, secular activists, and many others, both Muslim and Christian. Young people have been especially affected. Rights and freedoms, even those supposedly guaranteed by Egypt's 2014 constitution, have been stripped away. Political life has been sharply curtailed. Due process is absent. Powerful military, security, and intelligence leaders run the country. Today, Egypt is governed by fear instead of by the rule of law. Nevertheless, laws are very important to this new authoritarian system. Since Morsi's overthrow, Egypt has been steadily constructing a new repressive legal framework that surpasses even Mubarak's. The overarching goal is to protect those who hold power and suppress those who speak against repression and call for rights and justice. The regime also aims to codify authoritarian practices and give its actions a veneer of, quote, legal legitimacy. Egypt's parliament has played a central role in this process. This legislature was formed through 2015 elections that credible sources describe as heavily influenced by security and intelligence agencies to ensure that only regime loyalists would enter. The parliament does not even have any token opposition representation. Some lawmakers have complained that security agencies continue to dominate the institution. When a few brave MPs have voiced their concerns about this interference or objected to the legislation being pushed through, the parliamentary leadership has punished them for falling out of line. In one case, a prominent legislator, the nephew of Anwar Sadat, was actually expelled. My written testimony, which I've submitted for the record, describes in more detail many of the repressive laws enacted since 2013. I will mention now just four very briefly. The protest law makes authorized protests against the government effectively impossible. Under this law, thousands of young Egyptians have been jailed simply for peacefully protesting. The anti-terrorism law defines terrorism in such sweeping terms to include speech, writing, and other peaceful dissent. This law has been used to imprison peaceful activists who have nothing to do with terrorism. The NGO law, which criminalizes many legitimate NGO activities and severely limits domestic and foreign funding and imposes prison sentences for violations. Its goal is the elimination of independent civil society in Egypt. The Youth Entities Law, which Parliament passed just yesterday, explicitly bans all political activity, even discussions about politics, in youth recreation centers and sports clubs. And in recent months, yet more repressive legislation has been proposed, including an Anti-Homosexuality Bill that would, for the first time in Egypt, explicitly criminalize same-sex relations. This bill would impose prison sentences for those convicted of homosexual acts, quote unquote, And for anyone who even promotes LGBT rights, it follows a police roundup of young people accused of, quote, debauchery, which is code for the LGBT community in Egypt, and proposed amendments to the nationality law that would open the door to stripping citizenship from opponents of the regime. Dissidents inside Egypt and in exile are at risk. The regime justifies all this draconian legislation as required to fight terrorism, but is exploiting a genuine terrorism problem to silence dissent and build up its own power. Worryingly, while the parliament is passing repressive laws at a rapid pace, the attacks of jihadist groups are becoming bloodier, as we saw in the horrific assault in the Sinai 2 weeks ago. The state's determination to crack down on all nonviolent opposition diverts attention and resources from the difficult fight against terrorism. Such repression also can breed anger and despair, enlarging the pool of disaffected Egyptians from which terrorist groups can draw support. Egyptian officials often claim that its parliament shows the country's democratic progress. In fact, it is only further evidence of the elimination of space for independent political and social activity. A legislature that excludes genuine opposition voices pose risk to Egypt's stability. Egypt needs representative, accountable institutions that can formulate sound policy responses to complex challenges and give different parts of society a voice. As we saw under Mubarak, in a country without such safety valves and without the rule of law or justice, an eventual eruption of popular unrest is certainly possible. For this reason, the United States must express serious concerns to Egypt's government about this human rights crisis. U.S. officials should press on 3 pivotal laws in particular: the protest law, the Ngo law, and the anti-terrorism law. Each of these laws blocks the exercise of fundamental rights that are essential for a peaceful and tolerant society. Keeping silent about the troubling trajectory Egypt is on ultimately serves neither Egyptian nor U.S. interests. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Hawthorne. Dr. Gerges, thank you for being here. We'll recognize you next.
Good afternoon. I'd like to thank co-chairs Representatives Hallgren and McGovern for hosting this important hearing on the state of human rights in Egypt. I'm grateful for the opportunity to share with you our assessment of the situation of the Copts in Egypt. Sorry. In January 2011, Egyptians took to the streets in a popular uprising that brought down Mubarak's despotic regime. Copts were significantly represented in the uprising, had high hopes as the rest of the Egyptians for an open secular civil society where all Egyptian citizens are equal before the law, free to pursue their aspiration. 7 tumultuous years later, such hopes have proved to be more elusive than ever, if not replaced with despair. From the outset, the brutal response of Egypt's army on October 9, 2011, injuring 321 and killing 28 peaceful Coptic demonstrators, several of them trampled under army vehicles, and what is now known as the Maspero Massacre, was intended to convey one message: Copts are not supposed to have a political voice in Egypt's future. That massacre, Egypt's army set a role for later terrorist attacks in Europe to use against peaceful civilians. The short-lived one-year rule by the Muslim Brothers witnessed increase in the attacks against Copts, their person, their property, and churches by fanatic Islamists. More significantly, for the first time, we witnessed mob rioters scaling the walls of St. Mark's Cathedral, where the Coptic Patriarch resides, under the eye of the security forces standing there passively. The second uprising that brought an end to the Muslim Brothers' rule and the intervention of the army brought back hopes to Egypt and the Copts. However, despite the overwhelming support, when it is estimated that 20 million Egyptians took to the streets, Copts again were used as a scapegoat. They were singled out for supporting el-Sisi and were target of Muslim Brothers' fury. 110 churches and Coptic institutions were destroyed or burned down by the Muslim Brothers in what is known as Egypt's Kristallnacht, as declared or termed by the Honorable Lord Alton of Liverpool, the United Kingdom. Since his election as president, Mr. Sisi pursued increasingly authoritarian measures to consolidate his power, silencing political dissent, controlling the media, imprisoning human rights activists, and above and beyond, failing to protect religious minorities. It is, according to Bahauddin Hassan of Cairo's Institute of Human Rights, more Copts were killed under Sisi than before. At this point, I'd like to point out that Coptic Solidarity is not an opposition organization to Mr. Sisi. It is a civil society actor that pursues awareness and advocacy for human rights and equal rights for all Egyptians in Egypt. Copts. It is a modus operandi of Mr. Sisi to paint all attacks against Copts as perpetrated by foreign terrorists. However, most of the attacks on the Copts are perpetrated by fanatic Islamists that are neighbors of the Christians they attack. As put eloquently by Fuad Abdelmenam Riyad, member of Egypt's National Human Rights Council and former judge on the International Tribunal of former Yugoslavia, the real threat or danger to Egypt's very existence is not terrorism, but the criminal fanaticism against an authentic part of the Egyptian nation and the state's lack of seriousness to prevent it. Since Sadat initiated the Islamization process of Egypt in the 1970s, Copts have been suffering the modern wave of persecution. Copts are indigenous Christians. They represent 10 to 12% of Egypt's population, or numbering about 10 million individuals. However, they lack any political representation. They have no political party or organization that defends or speaks for their interests before the government. This is an advantageous situation for the government, which has succeeded over time to co-opt, if not coerce, the church to toe their line. The recent denial by church leaders, the Coptic Patriarch Pope Tawadros and Reverend Zaki, president of the Council of Protestant Churches, delivered letters to United States congressmen in their visit in October 2017, stating that under Sisi, the situation for the Christians, I would quote, is much better, and Sisi has been unlike any other leaders in Egypt. They declared that the situation for Christians has improved, despite evidence to the contrary. A war of attrition. It is a fact that the Copts have been under attack in more ways than possible. The systematic discrimination, from systematic discrimination to the intermittent terrorist attacks or bombing of churches, it is the latter that attracts more attention. As the spectacular and as the loss of life and these large bombings attract attention, it is actually the heinous and systematic discrimination or oppression on a daily basis that doesn't meet media attention or condemnation. This entrenched system of discrimination is no less heinous in breaking down the Copts into a state of submission, hopelessness, and drives the dramatic rise in Coptic immigration from their homeland. We have identified 5 areas of discrimination the Copts are suffering. I would like to proceed. In terms of equality, Copts are seriously underrepresented in all government institutions. Despite their number, about 10%, Copts are not, much less Copts are accepted into military or police academy, judiciary posts, diplomatic corps, university or academic positions, and all of these positions are limited to 1 or 2% invisible ceiling. There are no Copts in sensitive areas such as state security, intelligence, leading army command posts, and no Copt will dare to run for president. The entire governance system, local governance system on the level of the governorates in Egypt is lacking any Copt. Not a single governor in Egypt is a Copt or even deputy governor. In terms of freedom of conscience or belief, the passage of the new church construction law was touted by Sisi's government as a huge achievement. In fact, it proved seriously flawed. As Mr. Bahauddin Hassan of the Cairo Institute of Human Rights Studies put it, For the first time in Egypt's modern history, it was under Sisi's tenure that Copts were considered quote-unquote a sect, not equal citizen, since they also ignored the collective demand for a unified law of houses of worship that will put on equal footing churches and mosques at the same time, on equal footing in terms of permits for building. The vast majority of Egypt's villages are devoid of any churches. Copts get arrested for quote praying without a permit if they could congregate in a house just to worship together. 4 Coptic Orthodox churches recently were closed down by state security and many a governorate, quote, for lack of permit. Ironically, the Minister of Endowment of Islamic Affairs boasted just recently, November 10, that almost 200 newly built mosques were inaugurated in the previous 40 days. In terms of hate culture, the government in Egypt is actively imposing Sunni Islam in the public sphere to a suffocating level to gain support. This only leads to alienate and denigrate those who don't belong to the Sunni Islamic majority. Sermons in mosques throughout the country and broadcast on TV are awash with hate speech against non-Muslims. Religious figures from the Sheikh of Azhar to the regular sheikh in Egyptian mosques always denigrate Egyptian Christians and Jews, calling them kuffars. This is not mere Sharia classification. It has implication. Once you are declared a kafir, you are an infidel, your blood is fair game. The recent heinous attack by Islamists targeting Sufi Muslim in Sinai is just an example that there is no limit to the hate culture. Blasphemy laws during Sisi's tenure has increased and unfairly targeting Muslims and unfairly targeting Copts and even Muslim reformers. A culture of impunity. We here notice that most of the attacks are shrugged by the security system. Attackers are let go. Copts who have suffered damages are forced to reconciliation laws or reconciliation sessions where they have to reconcile with their attackers and give up the right to go or meet their attackers in court. Another area is the education, where Copts, the area of education or culture, we see that in most, particularly Arabic language classes or courses, where non-Muslims are denigrated. History courses usually trivialize the contribution of the Copts to Egypt's history. Social studies classes ignore issues such as equality, citizenship, individuality, and freedom of conscience. Blasphemy laws have increased in terms of their application. The culture of impunity, I went over that. In conclusion, Copts are facing a multifaceted war of attrition that leaves them few choices, namely convert to Islam, live barely as a tolerated Muslim, enduring as a tolerated Zimmi, enduring humiliation and recurring bouts of persecution, or leave the country. Mr. Sisi wins accolades among some American politicians by demonizing the Muslim Brothers. While at the same time he is giving free rein to Salafi Islamists whose ideology is no less hateful than the Muslim Brothers. At this time, the United States is engaging Egypt in the fight against Islamist terrorism. It stands to exercise its weight on moral value to promote equality. The fight against terrorism is much less in the battlefield, but more in changing the culture of hate and impunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gerges. Mr. Stork.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've covered Egypt for the better part of the last 22 years with Human Rights Watch. In January 2011, I was in Cairo when Egypt erupted in a popular uprising engendered in large part by the abusive behavior of President Mubarak's government and security forces, including rampant torture, wretched prison conditions, politicized courts, and arbitrary detention on a large scale. Today, Egypt's seen a revival of these abusive practices and the impunity that protects the perpetrators to an extent that exceeds that of previous regimes. My remarks are going to focus on arrests, torture, disappearances, and prison conditions. Arrests. Our best guess, our best conservative estimate is something like at least 67,000 people have been arrested since the military coup in July 2013, including secular and leftist activists, as well as alleged supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood. I want to draw attention to the authorities' disregard for the 2-year legal limit on pretrial detention. By routinely renewing temporary detention orders, making pretrial detention essentially a tool of political punishment without trial. Exhibit A, the 3-year detention of Egyptian-American child rights activist Aya Hagazi, her husband, and others. Though ultimately acquitted, their prolonged incarceration showed the perverse consequences of pretrial detention practices, along with dilatory court proceedings typical in cases involving social and political activists. Another case to highlight, Ismail Iskandrani, one of the very few Egyptian journalists reporting on Sinai developments. He was arrested in November 29, 2015. An officer told his family then he would be released in a few hours. He remains in jail today, more than 2 years later, on these renewable 45-day detention orders on charges of, quote, disseminating false news for his reporting on Sinai developments. As you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, on June 30th, authorities detained Hassam Khalaf and his wife, Ola El-Qaradawi. Ola is the daughter of the renowned Islamic cleric, Yusuf El-Qaradawi, a prominent critic, but who has lived in Qatar for many years. Their families believe their detention is rooted in the Saudi Arabia-led campaign against the Qatari government. They are in solitary confinement in separate prisons, denied visits by family and lawyers in violation of Egyptian law. Political opponents, when they finish a sentence, it doesn't mean you're free. Consider the cases of Ahmed Maher and Mohamed Adel, founders of the April 6th movement. They finished their 3-year illegal assembly sentences in January and are now subject to highly abusive, punitive conditions of probation. Judges set the period of probation, 3 years, but the police determine the specifics without any oversight. The police require Maher and Adel to spend 12 hours every night from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. in their respective police stations, leaving Maher unable to resume his profession as a civil engineer or care for his ill mother, and Adel unable to resume his Cairo University studies. Violation of probation has resulted in renewed imprisonment for several activists. Alaa Abdel Fattah, a prominent secular activist, is serving 5 years for organizing a peaceful demonstration in violation of the law that Amy Hawthorne outlined. Abdel Fattah and 23 others, including Michelle Dunn's Carnegie colleague Amr Hamzawi, face up to 5 years in a separate case for allegedly defaming the judiciary after they criticized the courts for lack of independence, correctly criticized the courts. Human rights defenders are not immune to these arrest sweeps. In May, police arrested Hanan Badruddin, co-founder of the Association of Families of the Disappeared, when she met with a formerly disappeared person in an effort to get information about her husband, who had been disappeared in July 2013. Authorities arrested Ibrahim Metwali, a co-founder of the association, in September, as he was about to board a flight to Geneva to present the UN Human Rights Council with a file on enforced disappearances in Egypt, including his son, Amr, who was disappeared 4 years ago. Recent headlines have highlighted the activities of the General Directorate for Protecting Public Morality, the so-called Morality Police, following the October roundup of more than 75 people for alleged debauchery, after some unfurled a rainbow banner at a Cairo concert. But this is just the latest episode in an escalating Ministry of Interior campaign against perceived homosexual and transgender persons. Prior to this incident, the annual number of arrests in debauchery cases jumped since October 2013 to 5 times over the previous decade. The campaign features sophisticated entrapment tactics and, following arrests, forced submission to anal examinations, an archaic procedure with no evidentiary value and which the World Medical Association has condemned as a form of torture. On torture, it saddens me to say that the Interior Ministry's National Security Agency has been at the forefront of reviving the use of torture during interrogations. Another element to this that I want to underscore is the role of prosecutors, who typically ignore complaints, refuse to investigate allegations, and often threaten detainees with additional abuse. Officials at the highest level, including President Assisi, have effectively green-lighted the crime of torture by failing, despite widespread evidence, to authorize independent investigations or otherwise hold perpetrators accountable, making them complicit in crimes that are widespread and systematic. In other words, crimes against humanity. We published in September a report showing how National Security Agency officers tortured suspects to coerce confessions, implicate others, or simply to inflict punishment, starting with warrantless arrests, torture during periods of enforced disappearance. In 13 of the 20 cases we documented, the individuals were tortured in national security offices, and 6 of them in the NSA headquarters inside the Interior Ministry. I provide a lot more detail on this in my written testimony, with your permission, I'd ask to be inserted in the record. The behavior of prosecutors paints a very disturbing picture of complicity in perpetrating and covering up torture at every level of Egyptian law enforcement. President Sisi's response is to silence Egyptians trying to erase the scourge of torture. The Nadim Center for the Rehabilitation of Victims of Torture received a government closure order in early 2016. This year, in early February, authorities physically sealed the group's premises, the first physical closure of an independent human rights organization. Reflecting the same policy, authorities summoned Nagad El-Barai, a prominent defense attorney and rights advocate, several times for an interrogation on charges of, quote, broadcasting false information and, quote, disturbing public security, after his law firm sent to President Assisi a draft bill that would criminalize torture. 2 judges faced disciplinary hearings before the Supreme Judicial Council for their collaboration with El-Barai on this memo. The matter of enforced disappearances is closely connected with extrajudicial executions, which have shown a sharp rise over the last couple of years. National security officers disappear detainees for days or months, during which time they torture suspects to coerce them to sign prepared confessions. In my written testimony, I described 2 separate incidents in November 2016 and January 2017, in which security officers or armed men operating under their supervision murdered suspects in their custody in incidents staged for video as shootouts with quote-unquote terrorists, in which the murdered men turned out to have been disappeared into custody months earlier. I also describe an incident from July 2015 when the National Security Agency staged a raid in Cairo to cover up extrajudicial executions of 9 mid-level Muslim Brotherhood leaders. Lastly, on prison conditions, the quasi-official National Council for Human Rights has reported on severe prison overcrowding as well as the harsh conditions facing the country's expanding prison population. Human Rights Watch documented particularly bad conditions at Cairo's Scorpion Prison, a maximum security facility inside the Torah prison complex. Its population of some 1,000 inmates includes many top Muslim Brotherhood leaders. Although under the nominal supervision of the Interior Ministry's Prison Authority Bureau, Scorpion, in practice, is under the control of the National Security Agency, renowned for its record of torture and abuse. A former Scorpion warden said in a television interview in 2012, quote, "It was designed so that those who go in don't come out unless they're dead," unquote. Many Scorpion prisons are political prisoners rather than dangerous criminals. In Scorpion, we found that staff beat inmates, isolate them in cramped, disciplined cells, and interfere with access to health care, contributing to at least 6 deaths. Treatment sometimes amounted to torture, and in any case clearly violate international norms for the treatment of prisoners. Prisoners were denied basic hygiene necessities such as soap and toothbrushes, as well as books and newspapers. Inmates have to sleep on concrete platforms without mattresses and only blankets or cardboard for cushioning. Scorpion is not the only problem prison. Families of prisoners in Al-Abadiyya prison are confined in cells 1.5 by 2 meters without ventilation, with a bucket as a toilet, and allowed out for 15 minutes every 24 hours to empty the bucket. In December 2016, when prisoners at Borg Al Arab prison in Alexandria protested poor conditions, security forces attacked them with batons, tear gas, and pepper spray, injuring hundreds with burns and fractures. And then prison authorities then ransacked the cells, throwing away belongings, including clothes, medicines, and hygiene products. Mr. Chairman, thank you again for convening this hearing. I noticed that the Egyptian Foreign Ministry put out statements earlier today calling attention to this hearing and talking about how it was biased and unfair and how Egypt's not getting a fair shake. I think what we've been telling you today has to be part of the record, has to be part of the shake that Egypt gets. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Stark. Dr. Dunn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You've heard from the other witnesses about the shocking and unprecedented human rights abuses in Egypt since the 2013 military coup. I will offer some recommendations about how the United States, a longtime ally and supporter of Egypt, can engage with Egypt on these issues. So the United States needs to be concerned about human rights abuses in Egypt for several reasons. First of all, of course, there's the longstanding American commitment to the principle of defending and advocating internationally recognized human rights norms, which this commission in particular upholds. In addition to that, human rights abuses in Egypt endanger U.S. interests, as well as those of our close allies in Israel, in Europe, and so forth, who can be affected directly by instability in that country. You've heard from the other witnesses about how human rights abuses affect, in particular, young people in Egypt, in the thousands, in the tens of thousands. And this creates a great danger of radicalization. We see that the terrorist groups in Egypt, no matter how many are arrested or killed by security forces, they replenish their ranks very, very easily, unfortunately. And I think that's because of the great alienation that young people in Egypt feel in large measure because of human rights abuses. It also leads to a lot of people in Egypt being unwilling to cooperate with the government on intelligence and so forth against terrorism because they are alienated by human rights abuses and other things in Egypt as well. Beyond even principles and interests, the United States has a special responsibility to address human rights abuses in Egypt because of its long-time relationship with the Egyptian government and with the Egyptian military, which has received more than $47 billion in security assistance from American taxpayers since the mid-1970s. And that included in 2017, Mr. Chairman, about 20% of all foreign military financing funds went to Egypt. Now, how to undo the Gordian knot of military rule and human rights abuses is a problem for Egyptians, not Americans. But as Americans, we must look ourselves in the mirror, ask whether we're playing as constructive a role as possible, and adjust our actions accordingly. So here are my specific recommendations. First of all, the United States should ensure that U.S. security assistance to Egypt is not itself used to carry out human rights abuses. Within the past year alone, evidence has emerged that American-provided equipment has been used to carry out summary executions in the Sinai, similar to the ones that Mr. Stork mentioned in the Cairo area, and that American-trained security units have performed degrading exams on suspected members of the LGBT community. The United States government should implement the recommendations contained in the April 2016 General Accountability Office report calling for strengthening end-use monitoring and human rights vetting in Egypt, which the government of Egypt has often blocked. Secondly, the United States should act more assertively on behalf of American citizens and organizations that have been targeted inside Egypt. Whether we're speaking of American citizens who've been wrongfully imprisoned or the employees of American organizations and their Egyptian partners who have been unjustly prosecuted, it's imperative that Congress and the administration press for full resolutions of these issues through releases, acquittals, or pardons. No one in Egypt will take U.S. concern for rights and freedom seriously if the United States doesn't even stand up for its own citizens and organizations. Third, The United States should conduct the bilateral security assistance with Egypt so as to signal that security and human rights are not separate realms, but are deeply connected. As we've discussed, human rights abuses are hurting the security environment and fueling terrorism in Egypt. That should be part of the defense relationship, and we should also maintain or expand the percentage of security assistance that can be withheld from Egypt based on human rights conditions. Congress should consider removing the waiver for national security interests, or at least add clear benchmarks as to when that can be exercised. Congressionally imposed conditionality has actually provided unprecedented leverage, which the Trump administration is now using to show concern about a number of issues, including human rights. Fourth, the United States should build an enduring relationship with the citizens of Egypt by showing that the United States is aware of their concerns and is using all venues to advocate respect for their rights. Sometimes U.S. officials and even some members of Congress are reluctant to publicly mention concerns about human rights violations, but it is important that they do so, and it is effective. The current administration should not repeat the mistakes made during the term of deposed President Mohamed Morsi, when the failure of U.S. officials to criticize his undemocratic actions fueled anti-American sentiment and conspiracy theories about U.S. intentions. The United States can do a number of things. U.S. officials can, for example, call on the Egyptian government to accept visits and reports by the UN High Commissioner on Human Rights, and can speak up in the UN Human Rights Commissions. U.S. officials and members of Congress can also make public mention of particularly important or egregious cases. You know, the argument is sometimes made that there's no point in engaging on human rights issues in Egypt because it doesn't work. This is not true. The actions of members of Congress and U.S. officials have an effect. Sometimes the effect is direct and prompt. Sometimes it's indirect, but it's no less important. And I'd like to raise just two examples that came to my attention recently. So first, the administration's current withholding of $195 million in FY 2016 security assistance, I believe, has slowed down the Egyptian government's crackdown on civil society and non-governmental organizations, and has the potential to reverse it. As you have heard from Ms. Hawthorne, President Sisi signed a draconian law that would make it virtually impossible for non-governmental groups to operate, but he hasn't really implemented it. As one Egyptian human rights official told me recently, I can't see any reason why the whole human rights community is not in jail, except that the United States has taken an interest in the matter. Second, mentioning individual cases of those unjustly imprisoned or persecuted sometimes can have an effect on their fate, on the case itself, but also on the individuals. Mohamed Sultan, an American citizen, tells the story of how a recruiter for the self-proclaimed Islamic State approached him during his 2-year imprisonment in Egypt, saying, "Your government has abandoned you." But Mr. Sultan told the recruiter that he had heard just that day that Senator John McCain had mentioned his case publicly. The ISIS recruiter had no reply to that, and he went on his way. Hundreds and even thousands of young political prisoners in Egypt can be spared the despair that paves the way to radicalization and violence if they hear that their plight is being mentioned in the United States. What you do and say here in Congress, as well as in the administration, matters deeply when it comes to the future of Egypt, a longtime ally in whose present and future the United States still has an important role to play. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Dr. Dunn. Thank you all so much. I'm going to turn to questions. I think other colleagues will be coming in a few minutes here. But first, if I can address to Ms. Hawthorne and all of you following up on Dr. Dunn's statements as well. You painted a pretty bleak picture of civil society and rule of law in Egypt. It seems that many of these restrictive laws were passed recently, and that there is significant momentum to continue this trajectory. Some question about implementation, if that's being delayed or not. Why do you think the current Egyptian administration is following the same steps of its predecessors? And what is the reason for closing off the civil society space, do you think?
Thank you. That's an excellent question. My assessment is that the Egyptian government, the Egyptian regime, is afraid of its own people. It is afraid that if young people and other Egyptians are allowed to freely express their opinion, organize peacefully, take part in politics, promote different visions than the one that is ruling Egypt now, that this seems to represent a threat in the mind of those who are in power in the country. And I think if you look at many of the repressive actions and authoritarian actions that have taken place since 2013, when the military led the overthrow, the ouster of Mohamed Morsi, you can see a consistent through line, which is laws and practices to basically suppress and control young people in particular from taking this role. I think that they have, those who rule Egypt have many concerns in their mind, but I believe that fear of what the population actually might do if they were allowed to express their opinions about those who rule them freely, I think that they're very apprehensive about that, and that is a major motivation behind all of these actions and practices. And that includes, as Dr. Girgis said very eloquently, not just Muslim Egyptians, but also Copts. He made a very important point that the regime does not seem to want Coptic Christians to be full citizens, to be politically active, to express their views.
Thank you, Ms. Hawthorne. Dr. Girgis, if I could address to you, you talked about, and kind of following up on the previous statement here, but you talked about the category of religious affiliation on identity cards and how Copts are excluded from representation in Egypt's state institutions. How do these two things specifically contribute to a culture of discrimination against the Copts? And does this discrimination appear to be getting worse? And what is needed to make the necessary reforms to combat this?
Yes, there is an overall culture of bias or impunity that when you have your identity card, if your name is Girgis, Michael, Mikhail, or Salib, it identifies you right away as a target. The identity cards and all formalities or formal applications, even for a club membership, you are required to put. It makes it an easy target. You are labeled right away for discrimination. There is a culture that has developed in Egypt, I would say, since the early 80s, where Egyptians have been gradually marginalized. There is a preponderance of Sunni Islam suffocating the social space. Copts are being shoved to the side. And even I would think that those who are discriminating against Copts are not even aware that they are doing that. That's where there is complete lack of insight in terms of the discrimination that is going on. It's just natural and automatic. It's a result of a culture of impunity, fanaticism, sometimes even driven by lack of education and even into political sophistication on the level of the individual. The attacks perpetrated against the Copts, they are not by ISIS. They are by their neighbors, who will, oftentimes you will see after Friday prayer, they get hyped up. They come out of the villages after Friday prayer, out of the mosque. They start stoning houses of Copts. There was a story that I have a couple of years ago, a 9-year-old girl that was thrown out of the balcony of her family's home. What did she do to deserve that? But I would assume these people who perpetrate such acts are not even aware of it. It's a culture of impunity and hate.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Girgis. Mr. Stork, if I can address to you, the government of Egypt claims it has a right to keep prisoners without charge in pretrial detention for extended, essentially indefinite periods as long as the court renews, and you talked about this every 45 days, this renewal. In what ways does this violate international law? And is it true that in some cases the Egyptian government fails to meet the 45-day deadline, but instead of releasing the prisoners, they retroactively extend the detention after the fact?
Well, let me point out that we're talking about a 45-day deadline in most cases, but the legal limit for the renewals is 2 years. And I illustrated that with a couple of cases with us, and in the case of Aya Higazi, that was clearly violated. And then when she was finally brought to trial, so okay, she was charged, still the refusal to grant bail, under international law, the premise should be that people are, continued incarceration should be is not the default. The default would be release as long as there's no flight risk, no danger to yourself or to your community, et cetera. With Ayagazi, and many people, certainly don't pose that kind of risk. So that's clearly an abuse of judicial authority. And I want to point out, it's Egyptian law. They're violent. And I haven't heard any rationale for that. It's simply, they simply ignore it.
Wondered, Mr. Stork, are political prisoners singled out for worse treatment than criminals? Have you found that to be the case in situations?
Yes. Well, I will tell you, the cases we focused on were people who were accused of political acts or demonstrating in opposition to the government, for example. Now, torture is in some ways like discrimination against Christians, a cultural issue, a social issue. It's not just a matter of cut and dried law. So torture is prevalent also in police stations, but where we found it systematically applied, and where I think it matters because it's coming at its very high level inside the Interior Ministry itself, is definitely applied to perceived political dissenters and not common criminals.
Right. Dr. Dunn, thank you in your testimony. I appreciate the recommendations that you gave. I think that's important for us as well as very clear challenges or things that we can do as a Congress. In addition to the actions that you mentioned, are there specific people or policy tools in the Egyptian government that you believe can make positive changes for human rights in Egypt? If so, how can the U.S. government strengthen its partnership with these entities?
Well, I do think there are many people in Egypt who are concerned about the human rights situation in Egypt. It's become something that it's really not possible for Egyptians themselves to speak up about. As you've heard, the Egyptian government has gone after the Egyptian human rights community, partly because I think they just don't want the information coming out. They figure that, the more the information comes out, the more that people are aware of what's going on and the more people might object. So, it's less the case in Egypt now than it was, for example, even during the Mubarak period, where you could find people within the Egyptian government itself and within the parliament and so forth who were concerned about the practices and would like to work with us. I believe Ms. Hawthorne mentioned the case of Mohamed Anwar Sadat, a member of the Egyptian parliament who was ousted, and he was ousted. It was specifically because he spoke to members of the diplomatic community about this very draconian NGO law that was coming down the pike. So this is it's a difficult situation, even for Egyptians who might have private concerns, to work with those in the United States and elsewhere on that. So I think at the moment it's going to have to be more of a matter of course, private diplomacy, but as well public statements and perhaps speaking up in UN bodies.
Thank you. I am going to ask a favor. I have a family commitment that I was not able to get out of, but my good friend and colleague, Darren LaHood, said that he would co-chair the final 30 minutes of the hearing. So there are quite a few questions that I have that, if it's all right, Darren, I'm going to give over to you. Thank you again for being here. Look forward to following up. We'll continue to talk on this. This is very important. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Co-Chair Holkren, and my name is Darren LaHood. I'm honored to be here. I represent the 18th District of Illinois. Proud to be part of the Human Rights Commission here, and I will continue with the questions here for Ms. Hawthorne. What is your understanding of the status of the NGO law? Is it in effect? If so, how are domestic and foreign organizations working in Egypt affected by the new regulations?
Thank you. It is my understanding that the NGO law that President Assisi signed, ratified back in May, has not been implemented. I believe the technical reason for that is that the bylaws, or what they call in Egypt the executive regulations that go with the law, have not been written yet. And that needs to be done before the law can be brought fully into force. It is also my understanding that the political reason for that has very much to do with objections from the international community, in particular the United States, about this law. And as you are aware, the United States suspended and cut some aid to Egypt in August, in part because of concerns over the repression that this NGO law represents. So I believe that the international and particularly U.S. pressure on this law has actually led President Assisi not to move forward with implementing it. However, it's important that we keep in mind that even though this new NGO law is extremely draconian, most independent civil society organizations, human rights groups, and other civic groups in Egypt are already living in fear. They are already under siege from their government, which is investigating them, harassing them, bringing charges against them. Even without the implementation of this law, the environment for civil society, and particularly NGOs that are not connected to the government, is very, very, very difficult right now.
And I'm not sure whether you covered this already. Can you give us a status of the NDI and IRI folks that were convicted in abstention? Where's that at?
Right. It is my understanding that the 43 defendants who were convicted in June 2013, which includes, of course, I believe 18 Americans, one of whom is Dr. Dunn's husband, there has not been any progress on the appeal process in that case. So they have been convicted. Ideally, there would be either an appeal process or potentially pardons to, reflect the fact that these people really did nothing wrong. They're not guilty of anything other than getting in the crosshairs of certain people inside the Egyptian regime. So that case remains where it has been. I know that the U.S. government privately is raising this issue in particular with President Assisi.
I got you. George, you state that the new law on church construction is not a positive step for Coptic Christian rights in Egypt. What kinds of obstacles are there in the law that prevent the construction of churches, and what are the primary constraints on religious freedom in Egypt?
The obstacles that prevent the new law from being applied, or let me put it this way, the obstacles of the new law are the same obstacles that we faced with the old law. It is touted as a new improvement. However, when you see the main criterion for building a church is clearance by security apparatus in Egypt that takes precedence over the law. Churches are being closed for being praying without a permit. The new law actually was supposed to be followed with a committee that will identify executive steps, how to apply the law and send instructions to the governors. Early on or earlier, the president should approve the building of even a church or fixing a faucet. Now this has been delegated to the governor. The governors have not gotten any executive regulations that translate this law into specific criteria that they should take into consideration when they offer a permit. Since the new law that was passed actually September 2016, a year ago, not a single church has been approved for building. The committee that was supposed to set these executive criteria for building churches met only twice in a closed session, and no one knows the proceedings of these meetings. They are not open to the public.
And what is your understanding of who's putting the pressure or stopping that from happening?
And I don't know exactly or directly. My best guess will be the security apparatus, state security. Churches are considered a security risk. You have to have a clearance for building a church by the security apparatus. State security the central forces or the Quwat al-Amn al-Markazi, the security forces, the central security forces, these all have to get clearance. You have to get clearance before you build a church. There are constraints in terms of where to build a church, how many people are supposed to be living in the area to build a church, the size of the church. These are all criteria that just put one obstacle after another, almost red tape, that you cannot really overcome. The same obstacles that were there before the new law, it is just reinvented as a new law.
And do you see any optimism at all that this will be overcome?
The culture itself has to change. The culture itself has to change, and you have to have leaders who are intent on changing the culture. Unfortunately, in Egypt, it is the opposite. The leaders are following the fanatics, and they bow to them. Several churches have been closed for no other reason other than to abide by the rage or abide to the anger of the local fanatics, that they don't want a church opened. For example, the 21 Copts that were martyred in Libya, slain on the shores, 3 of them belonged to a small village, and they wanted to build a church for them. The Muslim fanatics in that village refused a church be built. It has to go at the periphery of the church, of the village, to be built. When you have a church built at the periphery, there is a risk of traveling back and forth from your home to the periphery of the village, and there is a risk that you can be exposed to all kinds of criminal attacks.
This issue of construction for Coptics, has the leader of the Coptics in Egypt or the Pope raised this with Sisi, and how have those discussions or dialogue gone?
I do believe they have been addressed. I cannot say I'm privy to how they were addressed or the exact discussion. The church has been co-opted by the state. There is no doubt in my mind. When you see attacks on the Copts, and we have also Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy, they have a program that's called Ishhad. They document all the attacks. When the church comes out to say the attacks under Sisi have been much less, things have been much better, despite every objective measure that says the attacks have actually increased, even compared to Mubarak time. I don't know how you can take any credible statement, either by Pope Tawadros or Andrea Zaki, head of the Council of Protestant Churches in Egypt. They have issued statements to a delegation by U.S. congressmen that visited Egypt in February, saying that Sisi is the best president in modern age or modern time. I'm paraphrasing. I have the statement actually quoted in our statement today. So the church has been co-opted. I don't take what Pope Tawadros or Andrea Zaki I take what they say with a grain of salt. In fact, a large grain of salt.
Thank you. Mr. Stork, do you have any comments on that?
Not on that. I would like to comment, though, in response to your question about the NGO law.
Yeah. Okay.
I think Amy outlined the situation quite well. But I'd like to point out that the old NGO law, which is not exactly a shining light of legislative integrity, is the one in effect. And it's under the old NGO law that the case 173 against the American and American-related institutions was brought. And in addition to the cases that Amy mentioned, there are at least a score of the most prominent Egyptian human rights defenders who are under travel bans, have had their assets frozen. They've been, in some cases, forbidden to go to work, go to their offices. So the situation, even in the absence of the implementation of this new law, is quite dire.
Thank you for that. Ms. Dunn, the current government uses the threat of the Muslim Brotherhood to justify many of their actions. In your opinion, how much of a threat does the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt represent to U.S. interests and or regional stability? If you could comment on that.
Thank you, Congressman. Well, look, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt has undergone an enormous crackdown since the removal of President Morsi. As I mentioned during my testimony, President Morsi, while in office, did many undemocratic things. But the United States was sort of trying to respect the will of the Egyptian people and work with him and his government and not criticize him too much and so forth. And this led to kind of conspiracy thinking that the United States somehow was supporting or promoting the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. I don't think that ever was true. It was simply that the United States was trying to respect the will of reasonably free and fair elections that took place in Egypt. Right now, most of the leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt is in prison. There are some of them in exile as well. In general, the Brotherhood has stuck by a commitment to nonviolence. They are a political opposition, and they certainly oppose the Sisi government politically. But there's this danger of more and more young people in Egypt, some of them young members of the Muslim Brotherhood, being recruited to violent terrorist organizations. So I think that's led to a lot of confusion. We've seen that the Muslim Brotherhood organizational apparatus is in a shambles. There are disputes about leadership and so forth. They are not, and nor really are they able to put out clear guidance of any kind to their remaining members who are outside of prison. So, in general, I think it's important to continue to distinguish between Islamists who want to practice politics but are not violent, and those who clearly espouse a violent path, such as ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and lots of other groups. It's important to distinguish between these things and not to conflate them, as the Egyptian government has done, saying they're all the same. And that therefore, anyone who has an Islamist political ideology is just the same as ISIS or Al-Qaeda. And I think that up to this point, the United States has continued to say it's important to distinguish.
Amy, I'll ask you, Ms. Hawthorne, what is your assessment of the practical impact of the government's crackdown on dissent, and what is Egyptians' public perception of the government's crackdown?
Well, the impact of the crackdown on dissent has been devastating. I have been working on Egypt for a very, very long time, and I'm not sure that I've ever heard from my Egyptian colleagues and friends the level of despondency and despair that exists among many, many, many Egyptians who are fully committed to peaceful political activity, and their lives, many of their lives, their families and friends' lives, are being ruined simply because they oppose the government. I think the effect has been very, very difficult on people's morale. However, and these are probably some of the darkest times that Egypt has gone through with regard to repression and authoritarianism in any recent memory. However, I think that the human rights community, the civil society community, the community of pro-democracy activists, they're still there. They're very strong despite the difficult circumstances, and they're very committed actually to peaceful political change. So although this moment is a very, very difficult one, I don't believe that they're giving up, and they're still speaking out despite all the pressure. And if you could just remind me of the second part of your question.
But the question was, what is Egyptians' public perception of the government's crackdown?
Well, to some extent, there is not full public information inside of Egypt about what is taking place in the country to the degree that there should be. The Egyptian regime has gone to very extreme lengths to crack down on, punish Egyptian organizations, journalists, and the like who are actually trying to talk about all of the problems that we've mentioned today. Even going to the extreme length of blocking about 400 websites of NGOs, research institutions, media outlets, some of which are critical of some of the practices taking place inside Egypt. So there isn't a full lack of information inside Egypt, but news and information always has a way of traveling. Some people are still active on social media, and many Egyptians are aware of what's taking place, in part because they're living it, and their friends, their neighbors, their colleagues are the ones who are being rounded up in the middle of the night and disappeared. So there is an awareness, and there's a very, very high level of frustration about what's taking place.
Thank you for that. And in terms of, do you believe there's any correlation between the unrest in the Sinai and the recent bombings that have occurred there and this crackdown?
Well, the situation in North Sinai is extremely complicated. What is taking place in Sinai in some ways is separate geographically and in other ways from what's happening in the rest of the country. It remains very isolated, in large part because of the Egyptian government's own policies of keeping it isolated. There is a long-standing tradition of repression and authoritarian practices toward the indigenous community in the Sinai, exclusion, alienation, not being able to have access to many jobs, very difficult socioeconomic conditions. And in the current fight against ISIS in the Sinai, the Egyptian government, according to credible reports, has used extreme measures to go after ISIS, has used tactics that have caught up a lot of innocent civilians in the process and killed and injured and displaced a lot of people who have nothing to do with terrorism. And so what this does is it creates an environment, I believe, in North Sinai, although the number of terrorists, I think, is reportedly relatively small. The surrounding communities and the populations in which they live are hard-pressed in some cases to cooperate with the state because of how they are treated by their own government. So there are a lot of similarities here in the types of practices: torture, abuse, detention, and so forth.
Thank you. Mr. Stork, same question. Give me your assessment on the political impact of the government's crackdown on dissent.
Well, I think in addition to what Amy Hawthorne mentioned, there's not only frustration, there's intimidation, frankly, so that, a lot of activists or would-be activists are, they know that when they speak out or if they attempt to have a peaceful demonstration, the law says any assembly of more than 10 people without prior permission, you're in jail for up to 5 years. These kinds of laws, these kinds of police tactics, they've discouraged a lot. So in some ways, it's very hard to read the situation in the country. Groups like ours, we're not allowed into the country, so we have to go in, shall we say, with a very low profile. So it's much more difficult than it used to be to get a good read. And that's just in Egypt itself. As Amy Hawthorne mentioned, Sinai is essentially closed off. I mentioned in my testimony the case of the journalist who's been in jail for more than 2 years now, simply for an Egyptian journalist, for his reporting, independent reporting on the situation in Sinai. So, journalists are not allowed in. Even, as I think you're aware, U.S. Diplomatic and military observers based in Cairo are not allowed into the Sinai either. So it's really completely closed off. It's really risky to attempt to say what the mood is in Sinai.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Ms. Dunn, how can Congress or the U.S. government better engage the Egyptian government on these human rights issues? In a perfect world, what should we be doing?
Thank you, Congressman. I think it's important, the U.S. relationship with Egypt has become more and more over time a security relationship. Sad to say, we used to have much more economic aid and people-to-people engagement and so forth with Egypt than we do now. And
just on that point, on the security issue, is it to the benefit of the United States to have that security, or is it to the benefit of the Egyptians and Sisi to have the U.S. supporting their security apparatus?
Well, certainly it's to the benefit of Egypt to have that support. It's to the benefit of the United States that Egypt be stable and secure. It is a long-time ally. It's Israel's next-door neighbor. It's in a very important strategic location. So the United States would not like to see Egypt destabilized. And that's exactly the fear, that the current practices in Egypt are leading toward more instability, not less. This is the long-standing disagreement, and it's become sharper under President Sisi's government since the military coup of 2013, that in ways the United States government and the Egyptian government agree on the challenges, but we don't agree on how to confront them. Sisi is using scorched earth policies and an iron fist repression to address this terrorist challenge. In the United States, generally we don't think that's what works. We understand there has to be military action, law enforcement action, and so forth, but we also tend to think that a more open political atmosphere, media atmosphere, civil society atmosphere, an ability on the part of the Egyptian government to engage more of the population and get their support against terrorism would work. So it's really important that we have those conversations in the security relationship. Secretary of Defense Mattis was just in Egypt this week. And that we have those conversations publicly as well as privately, and that we use that security relationship and the other aspects, the diplomatic and other aspects of the relationship, to deliver that message as consistently as we can in as many channels as we can, that basically respect for human rights and improving their security are closely related, that these aren't two completely different things that have nothing to do with each other.
So that balancing act that you just described there, and how in a perfect world you'd be able to do that, is there an example of another country where we've done that the right way and led them to the ultimate goal of what we want?
Well, I mean, for example, I would raise an example of a country with which we've had a long-term security relationship, although of a much smaller size, which is Tunisia. And Tunisia also faces a serious security threat, a terrorist threat, a threat of local indigenous jihadi terrorists that have been carrying out attacks and so forth. But they're approaching it in a much more multifaceted way, right? They had a more successful political transition following their 2011 uprising, and the United States continues to work with the government of Tunisia on security cooperation, counterterrorism cooperation, security sector reform, but also, is able to encourage Tunisia's more open political atmosphere, civil society atmosphere, and so forth. In other words, that gives the Tunisian government many more tools with which to engage its population, work against radicalization of young people, and get the cooperation, intelligence, and other forms of cooperation from its population against terrorists. It's much more difficult for the government of Egypt to do that because of the approach that it's chosen.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate the analogy there. Obviously, I think they're obviously much different scenarios in terms of the population, in terms of the problems, in terms of the conflict there. And, I think about, countries like Libya and Yemen and Syria that are pretty much lawless, right? And the consequences if Egypt went that direction, right? And so finding that balance, that balancing those sensitivities on how you have those type of reforms and all those things that we want to do in a constructive, substantive way. Obviously that's what we're all trying to figure out. Go ahead, George, you have a comment on that?
If I may interject, Sam Tadros of the Hudson Institute, he teaches at Johns Hopkins, has published a thorough paper in terms of U.S. policy towards Egypt and recommendations to change course would be worthwhile looking at. Just a quick comment on the Muslim Brothers and Sisi's severe crackdown. The Muslim Brothers, all you need to do is look at their motto and their flag to understand what their ideology. It's a totalitarian hate ideology that they espouse. Until and unless they give up their violence tactics, they cannot be mainstreamed into the political system. I have deep mistrust of them. But you just need to read the writings of their advisors or guides, the supreme guides, and know what they are about. It takes one to know how serious a threat they are, as Sisi is saying.
And so am I to understand that you're supportive of Sisi and his government and what they've done to the Muslim Brotherhood?
I don't support any violence against any human being. I'm just saying, when it comes to a group of people that espouse violence, and even if they say we abandon that, you have to see that they do that for sure rather than take what they do as a tactical step, abandoning violence and tactically, but they still have their own old ways.
Thank you. Go
Mr.
ahead,
Chairman,
Mr.
could I
Stork.
in terms of the point you just made about a law-abiding society,
Yes.
I think one of our points is that Egypt today is not a law-abiding society. First of all, the laws that have been implemented by decree under President Sisi are, in many cases, do not comply with international standards, with the treaties that Egypt itself has signed. Secondly, I think the laws, Egypt does not comply with its own laws. Torture is against the law in Egypt, okay? Disappearances are against the law in Egypt. These are exactly the kinds of things that are happening. So it's lawlessness at a very high level, as well as at the sort of mob level that George was talking about. But we can't have, you can't bring law and order to the village, to the city streets, when you have the highest levels of the government essentially sanctioning crimes like torture.
So in terms,
This is where security apparatuses, intelligence, they are above the law in general.
and so same question that I asked Ms. Dunn. So how do you engage the U.S. government in terms of, public policy that would change exactly what you're talking about there?
Well, I think one of the key things is the word public, which you just mentioned. I think the policy, when we talk with our interlocutors in the administration, or previous administrations, or in the State Department and the embassies and so forth, we're always assured that yes, we raise these cases, or we talk about human rights every time we have these high-level meetings. Well, frankly, we have no way of knowing if they do or don't, or if they do it in the most general way that it's essentially meaningless. So I think there has to be, also, as well as private diplomacy, there has to be public diplomacy. There have to be public statements at the appropriate level. And as Michelle Dunn mentioned, there has to be consistency. There have to be, the same message from the same messengers, okay, whether it's the Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense or the Chief of Staff and so forth.
Yes, Ms. Hawthorne.
I just add to the words of my colleagues on the terrorism challenge. Egypt does face a very serious terrorism challenge. Some of the attacks all of the attacks that have taken place are absolutely shocking against Christians worshiping in churches and against Muslims praying in mosques. It's horrific. I think the message that the United States, as my colleagues have said, needs to keep sending to the Egyptian government is, number one, we want you to succeed in vanquishing this terrorist threat. It's in your interest and it's in our interest. But number two, when you take such a broad brush approach, a scorched earth approach, as Michelle mentioned, there is a real risk of alienating and angering people that become more susceptible to radicalization. So the approach is potentially creating even more of the very problem that they're trying to address. And third, I think it's very important to understand that when you have a regime that has organized so many resources and is exerting so much effort to arrest, interrogate, detain, imprison peaceful activists who have nothing to do with terrorism. In fact, they also spend a lot of their time opposing ISIS, just as they criticize the human rights practices of the Egyptian government. There is no way that approach cannot but divert resources, attention, energy from what needs to be a laser-like focus on the bad people in Egypt. By kind of spending so much time and effort as they do going after people who have nothing to do with terrorism, it can't help but dilute and make their efforts against the real threat much more difficult. So the U.S. needs to keep mentioning this to our Egyptian official colleagues.
Thank you. George, you have one more comment?
Yes, I agree with what Ms. Dunn and Mr. Stork have said. The United States has a moral weight and has the weight of the power of the purse. Several people would say you cannot put pressure, the change has to come from them. In fact, we need to put pressure on Egypt to effect the change. They do not listen to any, if you leave them to their devices. There is a culture that has developed since 1952. Basically dictatorial culture. I say and I know what is right, and you just need to obey. The United States need to exercise the power of the purse and guide Egypt through. It's a tumultuous time. You don't need Egypt to be a failed state.
Yep. Thank you. It's 4 o'clock. I want to thank you all for your valuable testimony here today on this important topic, and we look forward to staying in touch with you. So with that, the hearing is adjourned. Thank you.